Now, before we get started, we couldn't possibly put on the show without our sponsors. So, if you haven't yet heard of or tried Heights, then what are you waiting for? You might already have a daily hair care and skincare routine, so it's about time that you made brain care just as important. It's what most of our secret leaders now add to their daily lives, trusting Heights to look after their most important organ for long-term health and nearer-term mental performance, using a mix of plant-based omega-3s and key nutrients that science says our brains need to thrive, delivered through your letterbox every month. Listeners of this show can get £10 off a quarterly subscription with the code LEADERSHEIGHTS at yourheights.com. And I want to take a moment to let you know about the immense e-commerce marketing platform called Klaviyo. It's what I've been using at my own startup since we got going to get a full 360-degree view of my customer, and I've not looked back since. Plus, the fact that 50,000 other e-commerce businesses use it to find out what their customers are doing so they can analyze and act on it to convert means that they're the perfect solution. Whether your scale is from your first million to your first billion, Klaviyo will set you up for success on that journey. So just visit klaviyo.com/secret leaders. That's klaviyo.com/secret leaders today to find out more. And if you're fed up of scrolling through jobs on LinkedIn, I think you're going to love Otter. They've handpicked the most exciting jobs at tech companies in London. Now, many of these fantastic companies are being featured on Secret Leaders already, and they've got job openings on Otter too. For example, Slack, Bulb, GoCardless, and Deliveroo. So, Otter is building a place for smart, ambitious people to find their new career challenge. Just find out more at otter.com, that's OTTA.com, and find your new job there. Now to today's show. Today's secret leader is the British venture capitalist Sir Ronald Cohen. In 1972, he founded Apax Partners, which is one of the UK's first VC firms, providing venture funding for the likes of AOL, Virgin Radio, and Waterstones, the bookshop. Now, despite the high-flying career from Oxford University to Harvard Business School to McKinsey and then on to founding one of the world's largest venture capital funds, it's not really been a straightforward ride for Sir Ronnie. Born to a Jewish family in Egypt, he arrived to the UK when he was 11, knowing very little English. He left Apax, the firm we started in 2005, and is now the chairman of Big Society Capital, which is Britain's first social investment bank. In more recent years, he's been well known as the author of writing his first book, The Second Bounce of the Ball, in 2008, and he's recently just released his second book titled Impact, which offers a fascinating blueprint for a hope-filled future underpinned by the social power of impact investing. So, without further ado, welcome to Sir Ronnie. It's great to have you on the podcast today, so thank you for joining us.
A great pleasure. Pleasure to be with you. Just once more correction, I'm not the chairman of Big Society Capital anymore.
I see.
I am the chairman of the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment.
Got it. We will correct that for the audio, don't worry.
Okay.
Great. So, to get things started, we want to do a quick fire round with you. So first off, I've already gone straight into it anyway, so let's hope I got it right. But so Ronald or Ronnie?
Ronnie, please.
Ronnie to your friends. Got it. Investing or philanthropy?
You're asking me investing or philanthropy? Okay.
I am.
Okay. So both is the answer.
I thought you'd say that.
Yeah, philanthropy is and always will be very important. But if we look at what philanthropy has achieved, we have to come to terms with the fact that it's led to most charitable organizations, almost all of them, in fact, being small and out of money. And so it does not provide the capital to grow, to help more beneficiaries in the way that it should. And so many years ago, we set off, in 2000, in fact, with the aim of finding an approach that would bring investment to charitable organizations. And that's how the social impact bond came to be developed. And so you need investment capital if you want non-profit organizations to grow, just as businesses need long-term capital.
Got it. Are you an early bird or a night owl?
I'm more of an early bird than a night owl, although I tend to enjoy both. Um, so my typical day starts with the gym, and late at night, I'm currently in Tel Aviv. I might have a walk along the seashore.
Very nice. What's your preference, business or politics?
I prefer business. I did set off on a political career by standing for election to the UK Parliament when I was 29 for Kensington, and then standing in the first European elections. But it was more of a follow through to my period as uh, president of the Oxford Union and Oxford politics, and more done for the experience than because I thought that I would become a professional politician.
Fair enough.
I,
So I've got one last question, and then we'll get into the big deep questions that we need to hear from you. So, what's your preference, Israel or the UK?
I like both. I owe a big debt to the UK for welcoming me at the age of 11, giving me a first class education, giving me the values of democracy, which has been around for for centuries. At the same time, having left Egypt as a refugee, had all of our possessions confiscated by the government, leaving only with a suitcase and 10 Egyptian pounds each. I'm aware of the fact that being Jewish does not really give you any guarantee of security in the country where you live. And so, from my earliest days, I have felt that the existence of Israel was absolutely crucial to the future of the Jewish people. So I'm very lucky to be British. I'm currently resident in Israel because my wife is Israeli. Her father, interestingly enough, was the commander of the Exodus, the famous ship that brought Holocaust survivors to Israel in 1947. So my wife's family has very deep roots here. I've learned to speak Hebrew. And I have to say that living here in Israel, which is a young country meeting myriads of challenges, you have the feeling that you can contribute more directly to building up the country than you can in such an old established country as the United Kingdom.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I can understand that point of view. Um, okay, what did your? I mean, if you don't mind, we'll get started. You touched on a couple of these things already. So you were born in August in 1945 in Egypt, right? So how come your family settled there in the first place?
So it's a funny story because my grandparents were born in Syria. They had presumably come to Syria after the Spanish Inquisition made their way across North Africa to Aleppo. When the caravan routes began to die after the opening of the Suez Canal in the middle of the 19th century, a lot of Jewish merchants moved down to the Lebanon or to Egypt. And my mother's family moved from Aleppo to Alexandria, and my father's family moved to Cairo. So my parents were born in Egypt, and so was I. And after the Suez Crisis in 1956, when British and French citizens were expelled, and my mother had a British passport from Aleppo days, interestingly enough. My mother was kicked out. My father had Egyptian nationality. He lost it, left as a stateless person. All our possessions were confiscated. And so I arrived as a stateless refugee to Britain, or in Britain, in 1957, in May 1957.
And how long did you remain in Egypt? So I obviously understand, there's a lot of history there. Obviously, President Nasser's persecution of the Jews played a massive role in your comfort and I guess psychological security. You even alluded to that very early on in our conversation. It'd be lovely to hear this in your own words.
I'm sorry, come again with the question.
So how come you ended up leaving Egypt?
We ended up leaving Egypt because we had to. We had a knock on the door in the middle of the night, early in 1957. It was a secret police. They placed my mother under house arrest because she had a British passport. We had to, I was 11 years old then, my brother was 8. We had to get out of bed and appear at the front door. A few days later, there was an X carved in the wall by the side of our front door. And my mother was called in front of a sort of military tribunal, and having been placed under house arrest for 3 weeks. And it was made clear that we were not wanted. Now, all British and French citizens were expelled by Nasser, but it became impossible for Jews to be there either, if they had other nationalities or if they were Egyptian, because Israel's role in the campaign and Nasser's, a famous opposition for the state of, or to the state of Israel, made it very obvious that there was no future for Jews in Egypt. This, in a way, does not obscure my childhood memories of Egypt being a very happy place where Jews, Arabs, Muslims, and Christians went to each other's services at the Catholic school I attended, and where I was not aware of religious differences, really. It was a very liberal society. Egyptian people are basically liberal and tolerant by nature, but politics came to interfere with that.
And when you arrived in the UK, as I understand it, your father started his own business, but you arrived with just £10. So it's the very inspiring, I guess, immigrant story that ultimately does a great job of explaining the power and importance of being pro-immigration, because obviously this is a story of humanity and a story of the people too. So it'd be great to get in your own words the start you had in life and the inspiration from your family's attitude towards that experience.
Well, my family framed it very much as a challenge. The minute we arrived in a rented apartment in Golders Green, in Corringham Road, my mother baked a cake, a chocolate cake, as I remember, to show that life was going on as normal. My parents quickly recruited a young man to teach me English. My father took me to meet the headmaster of Orange Hill Grammar School, a school which had just been turned into a grammar school a couple of years before, from being not a comprehensive, I suppose it was a technical college in those days. So a school without an academic record, really, of any particular note, but with an outstanding headmaster and an outstanding history teacher, Richard Farley. Everything was made to look like a challenge, a positive challenge, if you like. When my father met the headmaster, he asked for me to be admitted to the school and promised that if I were admitted, then I would rise to the top of the class. As you can understand, for an 11-year-old boy, hearing your father say that gives you a feeling of obligation not to let your dad down. And so that was a challenge, if you like. And then Richard Farley, bless him, my history teacher, after a year or two of teaching me, said to me, "But Cohen, you should go to Oxford." Now, the school, my memory, had sent only one person to Oxford many years before. And in those days, you needed to pass the entrance exam to Oxford. And they didn't have an A-level stream for students applying to Oxford. So I actually, thanks to Richard Farley, got into Oxford before I had my A-levels on the basis of my entrance exams. So you can understand that I feel extremely fortunate to have been helped in this way. And it's one of the reasons why I feel a sense of obligation to help others. As we've chatted about earlier, I never thought that the purpose of my career was to make as much money as possible. I knew that I had to become financially independent because I would have to look after my parents apart from anything else. But I wanted to be financially independent in order to do more important things. And my life was blessed because I went to Harvard Business School on a scholarship and discovered venture capital there. And venture capital was a way for me to do good and to do well at the same time, create jobs and make money. And of course, it was the beginning of a huge field, which today, together with private equity, in which Apax Partners was also involved, is a $5 trillion pool of capital today. And so I managed to become financially independent, and at the age of 53 said to my partners, "Look, I'll leave at the age of 60 because I want to deal with more important things. I want to help tackle social issues better, and I want to try to contribute to achieving peace between Palestinians and Israelis." And
can we, before we get on to that, before we skip over, such a remarkable achievement, Apax Partners, it's very possible, for listeners of the show, you hear these terms, a lot of venture capital and PE firms, they all sound the same. It's complicated to remember on purpose, I would imagine, for some of that as well. It'd be really great to get a couple of minutes of your time sharing the story and the highlights from Apax Partners. Was it a hit right away? Did it take time to get off the ground? What kind of journey was that? And
no.
You are considered one of the most influential people in venture capital. And I think, a lot of our listeners are venture capital funded, might not have heard of you, might not have heard of Apax Partners. That's totally possible. This would be a real shame for us not just to hone in and focus on that time so people do have some context, because it's important and relevant.
With great pleasure. Well, if you're setting up an entrepreneurial firm that raises money to back entrepreneurs, you have a series of major challenges because the field doesn't exist. In 1972, when I co-founded what became Apax Partners at the age of 26, the word venture capitalist virtually didn't exist in Europe. It existed a bit in the UK. And the word entrepreneur was difficult to spell in the UK. And people thought...
My favorite quote about it, by the way, is George W. Bush, who said that the French have no word for entrepreneur.
Exactly. And the general perception in the UK was that entrepreneurship couldn't possibly take root in Britain because Brits were too afraid of failure. And society punished them if they failed. So it was a very difficult environment. And it took 9 years, from 72 to 81, before we launched our first venture capital fund in the UK, a £10 million fund, then the largest in Europe, together with the one launched by Advent. 10 million today, it seems like a pittance. The largest fund Apax has raised since then is 11 billion euros. And so for 9 years, we were providing advisory services to companies that, mainly smaller companies that wanted to expand, and usually to expand internationally. With the launch of the first fund, I felt we'd got ourselves on the right path. I sensed that venture capital would be huge. I knew that if we could deliver good performance, then we would be able to grow with the industry, and even faster than many of our competitors. And so I defined a strategy for doing that, which involved basically being very hands-on in the sense of supporting the businesses in which we invest, having a team of specialists, not just financial specialists with an accounting background, as used to be the rule in the early days of venture capital, a model which 3i had established successfully many years before. But we came in with people like Rhys Williams, who had been the CEO of Marconi, a huge firm that was part of General Electric. Later, John McMonigal, who had been a very senior executive at British Telecom. Hamish Hale, who'd had very senior positions in pharmaceutical companies. And so brought a different approach of bringing more than just money to the firms we backed. And then our funds grew from 10 million to 75 million 3 years later, and then a multiple of that, 190 million pounds 2 or 3 years later. And then 2 or 3 years after that, 1.8 billion fund, and then 5 billion, and then after I left Apax, 11 billion. So like every business, you try to shape a brick, and then you try to work out where you can put that brick down so that you can build an edifice. And finally, you find the place and you put the first brick down, and then it becomes easier to make other bricks and put them one on top of the other and build a big firm, which today manages 50 billion euros.
It's like a 45 to 50 year overnight success, that story.
Exactly. It's an overnight success after many years.
Yeah. And what are some of the more recognizable investments that people would know commonly that you guys have done?
Well, the most important investment we made, or the best known investment we made, which made it to the top 100 companies of the 20th century, is an investment where we lost all our money. It was the company that cloned Dolly the sheep. So here was something that appeared to have huge potential, but the technology came before there was really an application for it. But it is part of the history of the double helix and the decoding of the human genome and so on. But other companies that you've been familiar with, I'm sure, are Waterstone's Bookshops and Virgin Radio. My partner in the United States, Alan Patrikoff, who is still a very close friend, invested in AOL and in Apple computers. We backed over 500 companies, many of them backing people who came from modest backgrounds, in fact, almost all of them. And we felt we were doing something socially useful, helping people to become wealthy and make others around them wealthy. But I also realized as the years went by that we were contributing to increasing the gap between rich and poor. And so when the Treasury called me in 2000 and asked me to look at the issue of poverty and head up the Social Investment Task Force, which set me off on this journey in impact investing and to my new book, Impact, I said yes.
Yeah, and in 2005, you made your surprise announcement about leaving the firm that you'd funded, which I remember. Well, I say I remember. I've done the research and seen you had a quote at the time saying, "I'm leaving in order to devote my efforts to social investment, among other things." And the other things include an effort to help the Middle East crisis by funding Palestinian businesses, which is obviously an attempt to work out where the investment management business is going. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear some of your angles there, because I think that stuff is so important. We're speaking, you're currently in Israel. It's very easy for people without a lot of context to be like, okay, Jewish guy speaking from Israel, probably very pro everything. And here is the actual truth, which is, of course, all stories, Israel and Palestine being a very famous one, have two sides of the stories.
Yeah, I mean, because I still speak some Arabic, and I remember fondly, despite the hasty end of my stay in Egypt, I remember Egypt fondly. And because my wife is Israeli, and as I mentioned, her father brought Holocaust survivors on the Exodus and other ships to Israel, and because I'm British, I have a foot in each camp, and I'm viewed as neutral. So in 2003, with Sahari Solomon, a famous British industrialist who built up Hillsdown Foods as a big public company, we set up the Portland Trust with offices in London, Tel Aviv, and Ramallah. And we have had an office in Ramallah for 14 years now. And we basically worked on the economic dimension of the conflict. We've sort of coined the phrase that you need a triple helix of economics and politics and political negotiation to arrive at a resolution of this conflict. The third strand of the helix, of course, is security. And so we've worked to help develop the Palestinian economy. We initially worked on the financing side, copying the government guarantee loan scheme that had existed in the UK. About $200 million have now flowed through that scheme to small and medium-sized businesses. We then moved on to help develop the pension system in Palestine. It's hard to believe that if you're a Palestinian working for a private company, you have no pension at all. And we thought, look, by bringing pensions, we achieved two things. One, we improved the lives of Palestinians, but also a private sector pension system would attract $10 to $15 billion, which Palestine badly needs for investment. We're now working on developing a Palestinian tech hub with the help of many Israeli companies. I think what people don't perceive about this region is that not everybody is an extremist. Perhaps a third of the population on the Arab side and on the Israeli side are extreme in their views and want each other's destruction. But the majority really would like to settle this conflict in the way perhaps that we've settled the conflict with Egypt and Jordan. Perhaps not a very warm peace, but a peace that lasts, where there are cordial relations, at least between some of the leaders of these countries. And I firmly believe that this is achievable in Palestine. The difficulty we have is that, unfortunately, every step is taken advantage of by the extremists in order to deroot any possibility of getting to an agreement. So you have the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who famously signed the peace agreement with Arafat after the withdrawal by Israel of its forces from Gaza. you have extremists taking over Gaza in the form of Hamas, and then throwing rockets at Israel, vowing the destruction of the state in the charter of Hamas, which is still there. So you're sort of fighting the extremists, and moderates tend to be moderate. They don't go to the same lengths. And so we're sort of in a game now where the kaleidoscope takes a turn every so often and creates an opportunity for leaders on both sides to emerge and do what Sadat and Begin did, with Egypt. I'm an optimist about the conflict. Not many people are. I think the economic potential of Palestine to improve the lives of Palestinians is huge. This is an economy that can grow at 10% a year for 10 years or more in a row. At the same time, both sides are tired of the conflict. It's a bit like the Irish, the Northern Ireland conflict. Both sides are tired of it. You need pressure from outside. In the case of Northern Ireland, it came from the United States to show the extremists that they can't win. And if we get that at the right moment, then I think leaders will arise on both sides. And we will have two states living side by side, which is, in my view, the only way to resolve this conflict.
Have you had any personally really difficult moments in your experience of dealing with this, or have you mostly been able to operate sort of from the outside without getting your emotions involved?
I think because we operate on the economic dimension, people from both sides of the political arena, the Israeli and the Palestinian side, can see that this is helpful to the population. And so they sort of accept that our heart's in the right place, and that they benefit from our activities.
Sure. In 2011, Big Society Capital launched as Britain's first social investment bank, of which you were the chairman. So can you explain what a social investment bank is and what a social investment bank actually looks like?
It's actually a very exciting subject for me because in 2000, the Social Investment Task Force, which I referred to earlier, that I established and led at the request of the Treasury to look at the issue of poverty, came out with a report that said, look, it should be possible to bring investment to charitable organizations in addition to donations. But we need to innovate in doing this. And in order to innovate, we need to create a social investment bank that brings people with expertise of the social sector as well as the financial sector under one roof. And sure enough, I did that with partners. In 2007, we established social finance. And in 2010, social finance invented the social impact bond. The Peterborough bond, as the first bond was called, addressed the issue of young prisoners leaving Peterborough jail and going back to prison within 18 months at the rate of 60% or more of their number. And we defined a new instrument, the social impact bond, where the return of capital to the investors and the financial return on their money, the yield of their investment, depended on how many prisoners had actually been prevented from going back to jail because they had found opportunities to get jobs and so on and so forth, instead of going back to a life of crime and being arrested and going through the law courts and back into prison. On the back of that, the Cameron government, when it came in, picked up the file, and I remember meeting with Francis Maud at the Cabinet Office, and his saying to me, we opened the drawer on the Social Investment Bank, and we found the folder, but not much else. Are you prepared to work on this? And if you are, we're prepared to give you all of the unclaimed assets which exists in the British banking system. These are, as you know, the bank accounts of people who have disappeared and can't be reunited with their money. Now, I'd had conversations with the Labour government in 2005, 2007, and legislation was passed in 2008 to release these bank accounts. But to have an offer of £400 million potentially to set up a social investment bank was obviously fantastic. And we raised another £200 million. George Osborne was then Chancellor of the Exchequer. He'd been in discussion with the banks. After the 2008 crash, the banks were anxious to show that they could use finance in ways that help the most vulnerable. And so we raised £600 million in total. And as you say, it was approved in 2011 and we launched in 2012. And I was the original chairman. After about 18 months, I handed over to my very close friend and colleague, Sir Harvey McGrath, who had been head of the Prudential, and before that had led a big hedge fund group. And he has been chairing a big society capital and taken it to do great things. We have deployed almost all of the 600 million we had, but in addition to that, we have brought in twice as much, almost twice as much from investors who have co-invested with us. And the money has gone to fund charitable organizations or purpose-driven businesses, but the vast majority is charitable organizations. Now, if you'd said to me in 2012 when we kicked off that a few years later, half a dozen years later, 1.7 or 1.8 billion pounds of capital would have flowed to fund charitable organizations that improve lives in the UK, I would have said, that's going to be tough to achieve. But Harvey and the team have done just that.
So, what are the lessons that you've got out of this experience that you can share with other people that are looking to have social impact too? Are there any sort of broad themes?
Yeah, I think the world has changed. I think we are shifting from optimizing risk and return in making business and investment decisions to optimizing risk, return, and impact. And you can see it in the preferences of consumers who don't want to buy the products of companies that are polluting or creating social issues, young people who don't want to be employed by companies whose values they don't share, and most visibly, $30 trillion plus going to environmental, social, and governance investment, and another trillion or so going to impact investment, where you measure the impact, unlike ESG investing, you measure the impact. And that is investment money that is seeking to achieve risk, return, and impact. And I think there is a very powerful parallel with 1929. I don't know how many of those participating in this webinar are aware that in 1929, companies picked their own accounting principles and there were no auditors to verify the veracity of the numbers they published. And after the great crash, investors sat up and said, how can it be that we're investing in companies without understanding the real profits they make? And in 1933, the US led the world in establishing generally accepted accounting principles and the use of auditors. Now, at the time, people complained in Congress that this was going to spell the end of American capitalism. In fact, as we know, because of the transparency and the faith in our accounting system, we've built our investment market to be extremely deep and broad. $200 trillion of investable assets. Now, the parallel with COVID-19, the COVID-19 crisis, is that this money that is going to achieve more than profit has no transparency on impact this time. And yet technology and data enable us to measure the impact of a company as dependably as its profit, and more dependably than when we measure the risk of an investment. And so we are in the position today to do what was done in 29 for the measurement of profit, but to do it this time for the measurement of impact. Now, if we do that, if governments mandate that every company, starting 2 years from now, must publish impact-weighted accounts, we're going to look at companies in a completely different way. If I say to you that you can take 3 chemical companies, Sasol in South Africa, which has $12 billion of sales and creates $17 billion worth of environmental damage a year, more than the total of its sales. Compare it with Solvay, a European company of similar size, $12 billion again, whose environmental damage caused each year amounts to $3.7 billion in comparison with the 17. And then if you compare it with BASF, which has 5 times the sales of either Sasol or Solvay, 70 billion, it creates $7.7 billion of environmental damage a year, about 10%. Now, shouldn't these be numbers that we compare when we make investment decisions? And similarly, if you go into the supermarket and you pick a product, if you pick a packet of sugar or a box of tea bags or an OxoCube, shouldn't you know that one of these companies is creating 3 times as much damage environmentally as it makes in profit a year, and another one a similar amount, equal amount of damage to its profit, and the third one a quarter of the profit is the damage created?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. You're coming at it from an investment point of view, of course, and I think it's so interesting. Also, your timing on having this conversation with me is interesting. I'm sure you're familiar with B Corp, which is, I guess, for consumers, really, ultimately, it's for, as you know, for-profit businesses, so not for non-profits. My company, Heights, is a B Corp, and the great thing about it is it gives you a map. So from day one, we're like, we want to be a B Corp. We want to be the most sustainable company we can possibly be. Of course we do. Who doesn't want to? But what are all the decisions we would need to make in order to do that? And B Corp make it very, 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 very hard. But once you know the things you've got to do from starting up, so my company creates products and we have manufacturers and partners, and you have to realize that you have to pick them on the way that they hire their workforce, not just the way that you operate. And all of these things that you suddenly start to learn and take great interest in. And it's been a really rewarding process to deeply understand supply chain end to end, where impact relates and what your decisions as the CEO, what you're responsible for. It's totally your call who you work with. And one of the things we had to do before anything was in our shareholders agreement, we've got the classic PPP type, rule, but ultimately that we're going to put the planet as an equal level of importance to profits in the company. And all shareholders and new investors that sign up to the company have to sign that shareholder agreement, which means that we're all on the same page. We are here to create a profitable business, but we would never make a business decision that puts profits ahead of planet. And it's been a great way to just start afresh with a really clear and concise idea of where we're going.
And you're absolutely right, and it's inspiring to hear you speaking in these terms. I have been personally a supporter of the B Corp movement, and I think all companies will eventually go in the direction of B Corps. As you say, the methodology of B Corp is heavy for companies to implement. And if we can come up with impact-weighted accounts where the accounting firms are putting together these accounts in the same way that they're putting together the regular accounts that we used to, and the numbers are audited, it'll make it much easier for companies to qualify as B Corps. And you can imagine a world then where governments which are laden with debt, emerging from this corona crisis, and face unemployment that we have not seen perhaps in terms of numbers of unemployed since the 30s, begin to use our companies and our investments to bring solutions to our problems rather than to create the problems in the way I've been describing that companies create environmental damage. Governments can then begin to tax those companies that create positive impact according to the impact and the profit that they generate, and provide an incentive for a race to the top. So I firmly believe that through the measurement of impact now, we can bring risk-return impact to the center of our economic system and begin to create a world that is less unequal than it is today, and that threatens our planet much less than we do today.
And you've recently, I mean, this is a perfect segue, written a new book called Impact. So can you give listeners a summary of it and obviously, you know, a pitch as to why we should go out and buy it, which of course we should.
Thank you very much. So the book is called Impact, and the subtitle is Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change. And basically, it shows that this isn't just something that can happen and should happen. It shows that this is something that is happening. And it's happening because impact investment has really beaten the path to impact economies. What do I mean by that? Impact investment and ESG investing, which try to optimize risk-return impact, show us that our whole economies can do that. That if we measure the impact through financial accounts, which are audited as well as the profit, and show through the same set of accounts the impact-weighted profits of companies, then we enable investors to be much more discriminating in deciding which companies they want to invest in. And the value of those companies that are polluting and creating social issues will fall. And they will be overtaken by companies that know how to deliver both impact and a profit. By doing that, we change the behavior of companies and the capital flows in our whole economy. Well, that's reshaping capitalism. And it's within our grasp. This is not a far-off idea. We published just 10 days ago, we being the Impact-Weighted Accounts Initiative at Harvard Business School, which I'm proud to chair this initiative, the accounts of 1,800 companies, or more precisely, the environmental cost created by 1,800 companies internationally. Next year, we will add accounting for the product impact and the employment impact of these companies. And we will then be able to measure all the material impacts that a company creates and look at financial performance and impact performance at the same time. We will create a world where the companies that are valued most highly attract the best talent, the most loyal consumers, and the best investors, because they know how to deliver return and impact at acceptable levels of risk, and shift away from a world where companies try to deliver the maximum amount of profit without worrying what damage they cause to society and the environment. And then we all have to count on government to tax us in order to try to remedy the damage. It's a self-defeating system that has ceased to work. we need to evolve to a new system now, which I call impact capitalism, which is capable of tackling the challenges we face instead of increasing their magnitude.
What kind of reception have you had then from, I guess, people in power, right? So it's one thing to be idealistic. It's one thing to be working with some of the best universities in the world and delivering a program. And it's one thing to be marketing the idea. These are all really important because you need the groundswell of support, full stop. But at the same time, you're always working against forces with things like, governments turning a blind eye to even charging Amazon taxes and all sorts of things that just go on state by state, country by country, all these different rules. So how do you see this mapping out and making a real impact and creating the change that we need?
Well, first of all, as I said, I think the impact revolution is already happening when you've got more than 30 trillion, which is more than a third of professionally managed money across the world going to achieve more than just profit. That is a revolution in itself. I think we need consumers to buy the products of companies whose values they respect, and for that, they have to have the information to be able to make a decision. Similarly, for all of us who are in employment, we need to know what type of a company we're going to be working for when we take on a job, and whether we accept what those companies are doing to people and to the planet. And then as investors, all of us virtually have pension funds, and all of us virtually have no idea what these pension funds are doing with our money. So let us start to put pressure on our pension fund managers to disclose to us how they're investing this money, how much of it is going to environmental, social, and governance investing, and how much of it is going to impact investing. There's $38 trillion worth of money in pension funds across the world. Let's galvanize this money to do good and well at the same time. But perhaps the fundamental point of the book is that this notion that if you do good and do well, you're going to make less money is just wrong. By optimizing risk, return, and impact, in my view, you have the ability to deliver even better profits than just if you optimize risk and return. Why? Because you reduce the risk of your company, the risk of talent and consumers and investors walking away from it, of government regulating it and taxing it. That's a big risk, a big set of risks. But at the same time, you open the door to new market opportunities that you would not have detected if you hadn't looked at them from the point of view of impact. I want to give an example from Israel, where I sit, of an impact venture called Orcam, which sought to develop an artificial intelligence product to help the blind to see. It's a pair
my dad was blind, so this is particularly of interest.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So this is a pair of spectacles designed by entrepreneurs who built a startup into a $15 billion company, which they then sold to Intel. The aunt of one of the founders was going blind, and she asked him to help her. So they've developed a pair of spectacles with a memory stick-like device hanging off the side of it, which whispers into the ear of the wearer the page of the book they're holding, or the newspaper article they're holding in their hand, or the banknote. Now that in itself is a fantastic contribution to the lives of 35 million blind people in the world and 250 million visually impaired people. But if you look at it from an impact point of view, you'd ask yourself the question, how can I use my technology to help the maximum number of people in the world? And you get a surprising answer. The answer is, what if you gave these spectacles to the 800 million illiterate adults in the world? What would that do for their lives and their livelihoods? What would it do for the economies of their countries and even for the world economy to bring 800 million from not being able to read to being able to, in inverted commas, understand the page they're holding in front of them. So all of a sudden, your market goes from 300 million people or so
to over a billion.
1.1 billion. So I think that when you optimize risk return impact, you have the potential to grow faster and to make more money. And I speak as a seasoned investor who spent 33 years in a private equity and venture capital firm.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing those insights. Obviously, conscious of the time, so I want to make sure that we get to wrap up nice and quickly, but I'm going to ask you just a couple of last questions, if that's okay. The first is, what advice would you give to a budding entrepreneur?
Well, my advice in the second bounce of the ball was start young, think big, and stick with it. Today, I would add to that, find a major problem, social or environmental, that you want to solve, and define a business model that enables you to solve it while doing well for yourself.
Great. And then what leaders do you admire the most? Any particular people?
Our political leadership has left a lot to be desired in recent times. I think social media are part of the reason for it. But great crises call forth great leaders. I think we are at a difficult crossroad now, where some leaders are going to take us along the populist fork of the road, building on divisions and hatred and discrimination, and others, which are the ones that I look up to, take us down the road of a New Deal, realizing that our society is too unequal and that we're creating too much damage to our planet for our own good. Which of the world's leaders will rise to this challenge? I think it's difficult to say. But I have hope that great challenges call forth great talent.
Great, thank you. And then finally, well, two-part question. What's the best advice anyone's ever given you? And the second part is, what's the best advice you would give to listeners listening today?
The best advice I ever got was from our first chairman, a Frenchman who had risen from being a messenger boy in Crédit Lyonnais, one of the biggest banks in France, to being its president, its chief executive officer. And he said to me, always look to the second bounce of the ball. Everybody can see the first bounce, but if you can get to see the second bounce of the ball and understand where the world is going, then that will be a great help to you in your career.
And so your advice to others, if it wasn't his, something from your arsenal?
My advice to others is look ahead, be aware of what's happening around you. But if I had to pass my own pearl of wisdom to a young entrepreneur, I suppose I would say two things. The first is, you can't learn to swim by doing exercises on the beach. You can't keep preparing yourself for an entrepreneurial career. You learn by doing, and by your mid to late 20s, you're ready to do that. You don't have to prepare beyond that. The second is, principles have a cost, but they're always a bargain in the end. Don't try to take shortcuts. Live by your principles, you'll attract the best talent, and you'll be prouder of your achievements.
That's amazing. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've learned so much, but also just had a great time, and it's been an honor to spend the time with you. So thank you so much.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to meet you. I hear you very badly. I hope the recording is going to be okay because
I've got this microphone. It's absolutely fine, honestly.